This is We Need to Talk with Dr. Darcy Sterling, where I give you the tools and skills you need to love better so you can live better. Holiday weeks always make me feel nostalgic, and that feeling tends to make me reflect on people who used to be my life but no longer are. That's why this week we're re-releasing our most popular episode of all time on family estrangement. Clearly, this topic resonates. So many of us live in the tension between missing someone we've cut off and fearing that reconciliation would just reopen the same wounds that caused the break in the first place. If that's you, I hope this episode gives you some clarity and a little bit of peace. American families are in trouble. We have been for some time. The threads that bind us to our families, they have begun to feel optional. And in our culture of social media, where anyone with a cell phone can proclaim themselves to be an expert on subjects that they have no training or qualifications in, influencers are everywhere, and some of them are encouraging their followers to end what they deem to be toxic relationships, or to break unhealthy cycles, or to rethink the obligation of being in our closest relationships. I'm a fan of healthy relationships, and when they become exploitive, manipulative, or harmful, I'm okay with someone making a decision to exit the relationship, even when it's with a family member. I come from a family where estrangement, it was weaponized. My mother's generation regularly stopped talking to family members, and I have done it too. I have stepped away from siblings for years at a time. And when the pain of missing them grew larger than my pride, I've reconciled. I've been on both sides of family estrangement. And as we record this today, I remain in a standoff with a sibling. The gap between us just seems so wide, I wouldn't know where to begin to bridge us. I'm telling you this so that you'll know that I am truly torn when it comes to family estrangement. I know firsthand the pain that comes from being in a painful relationship. I understand why someone would make the decision to step away. And as a therapist and a human being, I have seen the cost people pay when they lose their tribe. So I'm hopeful that by the end of this conversation, you and I will both have greater clarity on what it means to be estranged from family. Why does this happen? What are the biggest mistakes people make when they're trying to reconcile? I've basically got a couple of generations worth of questions for today's guest. Dr. Joshua Coleman is a psychologist in private practice in the Bay Area. He's a senior fellow with the Council on Contemporary Families, and he's the author of the book Rules of Estrangement, which releases on September 3rd of this year. Dr. Coleman, thanks for joining me. You know, I don't just talk about mental health, I live it. And in my 20s, I built a boutique private practice that reflects the kind of therapy I always needed. It's called Alternatives Counseling, and we are now accepting new clients. If you've ever listened to this podcast and thought, I wish I had someone to walk me through this in real life, that is exactly what we do. We work with individuals and couples, especially high achievers, who are killing it in their careers and want that same success in their personal lives. We help you build deeper, healthier connections without losing yourself in the process. This is evidence-based therapy delivered by licensed therapists who are the best of the best. Change is hard. Doing it alone is harder. Come do the work with us at alternativescounseling.com. How did you get into your specialty?
Well, I was married and divorced in my 20s, and I have a daughter who's in her 40s who I'm very close to. But there was a period of time in her early 20s where she cut off contact with me for several years, kind of as a result of my becoming remarried and having twins from my current marriage and feeling in some ways displaced by that. And when she wanted to start talking to me about it in her 20s, how she felt displaced in her, I probably responded more defensively or explained or that kind of thing, maybe got mad, which of course didn't really bring her any closer to me, made her feel more alienated. So she eventually stopped talking to me for, close to 2 years for the most part. And it was easily the most awful, painful thing I've ever had to go through or hope to go through again. So it really wasn't until I began to rethink the whole thing and approach her more with empathy and take responsibility, not defend, not explain, find the kernel, if not the bushel of truth and why she came to that decision, that things began to turn around and we eventually reconciled, thank God, and have a close relationship. But as a result of that, I realized how many other parents are struggling with this. And the advice I got from my therapist at the time was very counterproductive, as advice often is in this space. And so I wrote my first book on the topic in 2007, When Parents Hurt, Compassionate Strategies When You and Your Grown Child Don't Get Along. And as a result of that, got a wide following of parents, both in the United States and in other countries. As a result of that, started doing a webinar series and a free Q&A. And as a result of that, did a large study of 1,600 estranged parents. And that formed the basis of my more recent book, The Rules of Estrangement.
Wow. So it really opened the floodgates, and you learned that there were a lot of other parents out there in a similar situation.
Exactly, yeah.
I'm glad to hear that you and your daughter are reconciled. As our conversation evolves, I'll share a little bit about my story, but I come by estrangement, honestly. It runs in my family, it's intergenerational, and it's interesting both how common and uncommon it is.
I agree.
How do you define estrangement?
I think of it as a real cutoff. Like, I don't think of it as a distant relationship. I think of it as when one person basically says, we're done, or we're going no contact, or I don't want you in my life. So I think of it as a pretty hard cutoff, but some people define it, there's more room to maneuver in there. I mean, I would consider a parent who maybe gets a birthday card once a year, but nothing else, and they're blocked on all social media or something. I would consider that an estrangement as well.
How prevalent is it, estrangement?
It's very prevalent. It's becoming more prevalent. There was a study by Carl Pillemer, a sociologist at Cornell. He found that 27% of adults over the age of 18 are estranged with a family member. There was a more recent study by Rin Resnick at Ohio State. She found that 26% of fathers are estranged from a child, an adult child, and they're 22% more likely to be estranged from a daughter than a mother. Their study found 6% of mothers are estranged, but other studies find that it's more like closer to 10 to 15%, that seems more likely to me.
Why do we become estranged? What are the causes of this? Are there patterns?
Yeah, there's a lot of different pathways to estrangement. If you just look at the media, you would assume that only terrible parents are getting estranged, because every day there's an article about why I had to cut my mother off or why I had to cut my father off. And typically it's, there's real abuse that's happened. There's incest, there's, abject neglect, there's horrible things that happened in childhood or in adulthood. And that is one pathway, but that's not the only pathway. Divorce is really common. Like in my survey of 1,600 estranged parents, 70% of them weren't estranged till their kid got married. So we know that marriage and the adult child can be a flashpoint, because you're bringing it together two cultures, even if they're similar from a socioeconomic, or ethnic level. So marriage a child's marriage can do that, but divorce can also do that, because it may cause one parent to alienate the child against the other parent. It may cause the child independently to ally with one parent more than the other, which commonly happens more with daughters with moms than daughters with sons or fathers with mothers. And it can also bring in new people into the child's life that they have to compete with for emotional and material resources. So that's huge. Therapy, I think there are many therapists today who are doing an enormous disservice to sort of assume that if an adult child comes into therapy and they've got significant depression or anxiety or attachment issues, that there must be a trauma or traumatic childhood in the background, which sometimes there is, right? We both know that. But sometimes there's not. There are a lot of other pathways to depression and anxiety and other kinds of issues. If we just look at the research with Gen Z, if you look, Jean Twenge's research that found that Gen Z, those born between 1995 and 2012 or 2015, they have significantly higher rates of depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation than, say, Gen X or boomers. And it's a cohort effect. It's more the era that they're being raised in, the effect of cell phones. So that's huge. Mental illness in the parent, certainly. Addiction in the parent, certainly, but also mental illness and addiction in the child. And finally, I think in the past 4 decades, parents have become much more intensive, much more intrusive, much more enmeshed with their children, because it requires much more parental help, to launch a child into adulthood. So I think some adult children get too much of their parent. They just feel like don't know any other way to feel separate from the parent, particularly with cell phones, where a parent can reach a child from anywhere in the world within seconds and then get hurt if they don't respond. So I would say that those are the most common pathways. Maybe to add political differences, that's also the newest one that's infecting family relationships.
It's interesting. I just want to touch on something you just said, that therapists, in your experience, have been known to meet a client and connect the dots between their current struggles and them coming from a family that's less than ideal, and then helping to facilitate or suggesting that perhaps that relationship is not healthy. I've been in therapy myself for decades, on and off, probably will be on and off my whole life, as I think everyone in our field should be. Make sure our stuff doesn't get in the way of our clients.
Totally agree.
And my experience, both as a client of therapy and as, a facilitator of it, and having heard so many stories of other people who've had therapeutic experiences that have been less than ideal, I've never heard of a therapist suggesting that a patient go no contact with their parents. And in 28 years of practice, I think I might have suggested it less than 5 times. I don't even know if I've suggested it 3 times. The circumstances of the relationship have to be so irreconcilable. It's the last resort. It's not the first idea. So I'm surprised when I hear this from you, because my experience, both through my clients and as somebody who's been a great consumer of therapy, has been that therapists more often than not speak less than they should, weigh in less than they should. And I wonder what you think about the idea that I wonder if in a therapeutic relationship, in the validating experience of therapy, which a client should feel validated, if patients are walking away hearing what they thought their therapist said instead of what their therapist actually said. And if they're not projecting their own desire to be free from a relationship that feels impossible to boundary up by walking away. I don't know. You tell me.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right that happens. Whether that constitutes the majority of therapists who are what I think are advising no contact. Like, I don't know if you saw that recent New York Times article about no contact, and that
Just last month, yeah.
Yeah, right. The therapist was, he has this massive following, and he has a whole regimen of how and when you should cut off parents. And I get letters all the time from adult children who say that their therapists are encouraging going no contact, or saying, well, my therapist has said that my father's a narcissist or my mother's a narcissist, and therefore family therapy won't do any good. So I think it's fairly common. I'm sure you're right that sometimes people in therapy hear what they want to hear, and there are plenty of therapists who don't give advice, or sometimes they give too much or not enough. But I think it's a real thing, and I think that sociologist Alison Pugh wrote the book Tumbleweed Society, describes therapists today as being, in many ways, detachment brokers. And I think it's a really apt term. And what she means by that is that we've changed in the past half century, past 4 decades, in terms of our notions of responsibility, like what we owe others, whether we owe our family a relationship. And so therapists in many ways help people navigate that space, where there's this notion that you shouldn't feel any guilt towards your parent. You shouldn't feel any sense of obligation to them, or duty to them, or responsibility to them. And if you are, then that may be an example of your being codependent. What really matters the most is your own happiness and well-being. And if you need to cut off anybody to achieve that, then it's just the cost of success. So I think that's a really common dynamic.
I took that therapist in the hearkening back to the article from last month in the New York Times. I can't remember what it was titled, but I'll link to it in the show notes. I went to his website because the first thing I wanted to know is this an actual therapist? I don't think people do that enough. I think we're getting a lot of advice from TikTok and Instagram from coaches who have no business in our space, and they should have to be credentialed to speak on the topics that they actually do have to be credentialed. But that's a whole other conversation that we'll get to later. So I went to his website. He is an actual therapist. I took took his is your family toxic? So I think the score was 1 to 5. 5 is the most toxic imaginable. I came out with a 4. But I'm a therapist with a PhD and I understand statistics and how tools are put together. And I want to know how valid this tool is. Where did it come from? He
Right.
created it. A lot of the questions were vague, they were a little ambiguous. They looked for binary answers. I'm curious to know A, how valid that tool is, and B, I would love to invite him on the show so that I could ask him a little bit about his methodology and the extent to which he feels responsible for, I think it's wonderful to have a platform. I have a platform, you have a platform.
Sure.
You need a platform.
Right.
But we have to be responsible when we're leaders, and
Absolutely.
we have to be very careful about the people who are following us. I hear what you're saying. I've just not had firsthand experience with that myself. And it surprises me because, I mean, again, I've had a fuller than full caseload for 28 years. If I could clone myself, I could have filled 2 people's caseloads the entire
Sure.
time, and sometimes I did 1.5 person's caseloads.
I understand.
And I have never heard of a therapist suggesting, and correct me if you disagree with me, I think no contact is a last resort.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I think it is too, but I don't think that it's being treated as a last resort. I have families in my practice who they're basically being ghosted by their adult child. And, what I often hear from the adult child's perspective, if, like typically it shows up in a comments section in an article, well, they probably had plenty of warning and they probably were told. And sometimes, sure, that's true. The parent's just not getting the message. And I've seen that as well. But sometimes, some adult children cut off contact, or people cut off contact in general because they're conflict avoidant. They don't want to have that tough conversation. They don't want to talk about how hurt or mad or resentful or misunderstood they feel. So they just avoid and go no contact. But I certainly agree with you. Yeah.
That's it. That's the common denominator. We don't
Yeah.
know how to have serious conversations
Right.
or uncomfortable conversations, and it's easier to just go no contact. I think that
Yep.
that's a big common denominator, even more so than the circumstances that create the estrangement in the first place.
I totally agree. Yeah, no, I completely agree. And, my method, since it's typically parents that reach out to me, my method is you have to help your child. If they can't tell you or you don't understand the reasons, you have to show curiosity and dedication and take responsibility and make it easy for them to have that conversation. Like I always tell parents, if, one of my big methods is to tell the parent to write an amends letter and to start the letter by saying, I know you wouldn't do this unless you felt like it was the healthiest thing for you to do, because that's how it feels to the adult child. So it's trying to get on.
That's so good.
Yeah, thank you. So it's trying to get on the same page with the adult child so that they feel like, oh, you actually want to understand. And it's true. I mean, most adult children, even if they're being brainwashed by, the other parent in the case of alienation, or their spouse is saying, choose them or me, you can't have both. They're still doing the one thing that they feel like they have to do. So if the parent says that, that's a way to open up the conversation and make it easier on the child not to be conflict avoidant. Or I'll tell parents to say something like, maybe I didn't do a very good job when you were growing up, helping you to feel like you should complain about me, or you should tell me what you don't like. And if you want to, tell me and I promise to listen or read purely from the perspective of learning and listening and not to defend myself. I mean, those are the kind of the conditions that the parent has to bring to the table.
That's such sage advice. When I spent the first 15 years of my career as I worked with adolescents, and in my practice, we didn't work with teenagers whose parents weren't willing to be parent coached, which is code for therapy, but we had to get them in the door without pathologizing them.
Exactly.
And I can't tell you how often I was very careful about setting up family sessions. I wanted to create a safe space. I did not want to replicate the circumstances that got them in my door in the first place. So I didn't want them to behave in my office in a family session the way they did at home so often. So there'd be lots and lots of psychoeducation leading up to a family session where whomever was the parent coach was teaching the parent communication skills, and I was more often than not working with a teenager, teaching the child the same skills. And when I would bring them together, so often the child would express themselves and say, this upset me. And seem, when it was not a defensive response and a
Yeah.
well-intended response, it usually sounded like an excuse, which immediately would propel my kid into one corner of the room. And it would, and in contrast, the parent would, wind up in the opposite corner of the room. And it
Right.
would create a situation where the kid then had to amount evidence for why they felt the way they felt
Yep.
because they're hurt to begin with. They've taken a risk of telling the parent. Now the parent's providing context. It is context. The context is important. Explanations are important. However, when we're trying to air feelings, we don't want to provide context or explanations until all the feelings have been soothed, because otherwise it sounds like deflection or excuses.
Yep.
And it sounds like you're not taking any responsibility for
Yep.
what you've done. I love the suggestion of beginning an amends letter with, I know you wouldn't have done this if you didn't feel like this was the right thing, the thing that you
Yeah.
had to do. Because I think it's important for us also to put out there that estranging oneself from a parent in particular, a primary
Hmm.
caregiver,
Yeah.
there's not a less natural biological imperative. It is
Right.
so contraindicated. If anything, I often see people staying in relationships so beyond the expiration date. And my goal is always like, let's find a way for you guys to coexist where you're not constantly being triggered left and right. And if that means that you have to be distant while we're building the emotional regulation skills, the emotional management skills, so that eventually you can tolerate your parent being who they are, then do that temporarily.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Yeah.
but that whole thing was intended to point towards, it is so difficult when you get two people in the room and they just want to lobby why they're not the asshole in the room.
Exactly. No,
So what do you see as the biggest mistakes parents or family members make that either that sabotage their desire to reconcile? You must see failed attempts, rookie mistakes in reconciling.
yeah, well, I made all of them with my kids, so I can speak with great authority. So, um, well, the first is to use guilt as a motivator. The old days when you could kind of guilt trip your child into submission or agreement or compliance, that ship has sailed. That's no longer the basis for today's parent-adult-child relationships. It has to be founded much more like a friendship, which means you have to do the principles that you were talking about. You have to be able to listen and care and be empathic and take responsibility and not explain. I think what you said is really, really right. The adult child who's been estranged doesn't want to hear, well, it's because of a divorce or because, you had mental illness or because I was a single mother or we had, all those things are true. But what I tell parents is that's for your self-dialogue. That's not for your dialogue with your child. You have to soothe yourself around those kind of things. You can't expect your child to soothe you. What they want to feel like you get it and that you understand and you're willing to kind of take the hit and just, be courageous and accept the ways that you're flawed as a person, because guess what? We all are. So I think making the child feel guilty is huge. Returning fire with fire, I think, is a big one. And if I think therapists with parents make a mistake, it's that they encourage them. They say, well, you need to set limits on that behavior. And, you need to set your own boundaries and you need to, remind them of all the good things and how lucky they are to have you. And that never, ever works.
That doesn't work out for them, huh?
Yeah, I know. Isn't that a shock, right? So that's huge. Not kind of accepting how long an estrangement is going to take to reconcile. That you're not going to be able to just maybe make one or two good moves in your child's direction and the seas are going to part. Maybe they will. Sometimes they do. Sometimes a parent will write a really good amends letter and the child will kind of go, thank God, I'm glad you're getting it. And they'll open the door. They'll be willing to do family therapy or something like that. But more often, if the door's closed, it's going to take some time and patience for it to open back up. Another mistake is kind of assuming it's all about you as a parent. By the time you have an adult child or grandchildren, for you, your adult children and your grandchildren are front and center of your consciousness. But for your adult child, you're not front and center of their consciousness. They're thinking about their own careers or their children or their marriages or their friendships. You're way down the line. So don't personalize everything and don't complain and don't criticize about it. And the other is to accept that it isn't fair from a parent's perspective, and accept that it's not going to be fair. Parents today, probably for the past 4 decades in particular, probably the best educated, wealthiest, most psychological. They probably have their own therapy. So they probably have given their children a quality of parenting much better than they got. And so they're so shocked when their kids aren't just completely grateful and they feel really unfair, like it's really unfair. But it's unfair. You're not going to persuade your child to come to the table by telling them all the ways that you benefited them in contrast to how you were raised. You have to think much more strategically. And being strategic means you don't say the first thing that comes to your mouth. You don't guilt trip your kid. You don't return fire with fire. You accept that it's going to take some time and patience. So I think those are probably the biggest mistakes that parents make.
In my own family, we are notorious for, or I've been on the receiving end of, extended family members speaking on behalf of the parent, trying to create some openness. What do you think about that in
Never
the adult
works.
child? Yeah.
Yeah, it never.
I can confirm that I'm part of that cohort of it did not work. It did not work. Hearing from cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins, brothers, that never worked.
Never, ever works. So it can be a revered grandparent. It can be a close siblings, people. The person who's doing the estranging or the distance, they just feel misunderstood. They feel ganged up on. The only thing I tell people who are not estranged to say, if anything, is, look, I love you both. You don't have to choose. I do think that let's say in this case, your mother or your father, they are open to working on themselves. They are willing to do family therapy. They are in pain about this. I hope you'll give them a chance, but I don't want you to feel like you have to choose between them and me, because you don't. So I think that's the most that somebody could say. Like if somebody had said that to you, would that have bugged you, or would you think you would have accepted that?
I would have melted. I would have melted. That would have been so well received.
Okay, good.
Because in the absence of that, just hearing that my parent would speak to extended family about it and act as though she didn't know why we were not speaking, when not only had I told her numerous times alone, but then I would have witnesses there, because I would feel like I must not be communicating clearly because my mother is like Teflon and she doesn't remember the reasons why we're not speaking. 2 weeks later, she's at my door, like, what is wrong with you? And I would never want to be unfair. I would never want to be hurtful. I've always loved my family members.
Sure.
I still do. But in the absence of that, it felt like my mother was character assassinating me to other family members. Like, as she was in her desire to appeal to other people who were close to me to bridge us together, what wound up happening was she would provide context and explanations for why we weren't speaking. And some of them turned against me in the process and were like, what is wrong with you? And I was like, really? Do you want to have a family session? Because if you have time, 3 hours, I can give you the last 5 years worth of why. And that doesn't touch on the 30 years before that. So
Exactly. No, right. So yeah, it's always a bad idea for some external person to do it. And you're right. You typically don't have the whole picture. And if the parent or family member is that clueless that they don't really understand, I mean, I'm kind of contradicting what I was saying earlier. I think that some people really don't understand, but there are plenty who have been given plenty to understand and still are acting like there haven't been a reason. And for those people, they just make their child feel much more hurt and much more alienated and more misunderstood, because from the adult child's perspective, it's like, I have told you. Why are you acting like I haven't told you? It's infuriating.
Well, you start thinking, if you have any critical thinking skills, like you're crazy. And that's the essence of gaslighting. I mean, at one point I signed a contract with her where we each had copies of it, so she would understand why, the terms under which I would re-enter a relationship with her. And then, that made me feel a little bit better months later when another family member would reach out to me and be like, why aren't you talking to your mom? I'd be like, you can ask her to see the contract. She has a carbon copy of the explanation. Do you think the rise in individualism has impacted the rates of estrangement that we're seeing?
I do. I think it's individualism. I think it's the way that therapeutic cultures become the way that we understand ourselves. I think it's the amplification of social media. I think it's the increasingly tribalistic nature of our culture. I think all of those things are really pulling us apart as family members and as individuals.
And can you explain? Well, I know you know what I mean by individualism. Would you mind explaining for the listeners what I mean?
No, no, it's a good question. I mean, individualism is basically a preoccupation with one's own happiness and individuality and identity and one's personal growth, in many ways above all else. And Americans, we rank higher than any other country in terms of our rates of individualism. And I would guess we have the highest rates of estrangement, probably in part because of that.
You know, I don't just talk about mental health, I live it. And in my 20s, I built a boutique private practice that reflects the kind of therapy I always needed. It's called Alternatives Counseling, and we are now accepting new clients. If you've ever listened to this podcast and thought, I wish I had someone to walk me through this in real life, that is exactly what we do. We work with individuals and couples, especially high achievers, who are killing it in their careers and want that same success in their personal lives. We help you build deeper, healthier connections without losing yourself in the process. This is evidence-based therapy delivered by licensed therapists who are the best of the best. Change is hard. Doing it alone is harder. Come do the work with us at alternativescounseling.com. Well, as I've touched on, I do come from a family where estrangement is prevalent. My mother's generation threw people out of the tribe. My generation has done it. I have done it. And when I've been estranged from family members, one of the biggest hurdles I've had when thinking about reconciling is my fear that if we don't heal the root of the problem, it's just going to happen again. So my question to you is, and I can imagine that this is a hurdle for people because many of us miss our family members, but we don't want to recreate or reenact the very thing that caused the severance in the first place. So
Yeah.
my question is, how important do you feel it is to address the root of the problem? And if you've been estranged, are people more likely to become estranged again in the future, the way we're more likely to have divorce with a second or a third marriage?
I think so. I mean, I think in some ways we're modeling it for our children if we're cut off a parent, or a grandparent. So I certainly think that that's the case. I think it's important to try to do it always, but we have to accept that some people are just too flawed and too damaged. Some people are just too traumatized by their own childhoods to be able to hear anything remotely critical, particularly from their child, to hear that you failed me, you neglected me, you harmed me, you really hurt me. I mean, I think I was blessed by having come from a pretty loving family. So when my daughter talked to me about the ways that she felt neglected or hurt, it was definitely stabbed me in my heart. But I think I also had enough psychological resilience to be able to, take a breath and then eventually, even though I didn't handle it great right away, eventually come back and be able to hear it. But if if you're carrying around intense feelings of self-hatred because you were abused yourself as a child, you're probably not going to do that well if your own child tells you that they felt really hurt by you or damaged. Because I think even the crappiest of parents still want to do a good job, want to do well by their children. So I think people should always try. And sometimes parents surprised me. Some of the ones who I think wouldn't be able to hear their children's complaints actually handle it beautifully. And others who I think should be able to do it can't. We never really know. But I think you should start there. But you also have to accept that maybe they can't. And then what's your position going to be? It may be that you're the one that has to change if your parent can't. Part of what's required of today's parent-adult-child relationships, if we're predicating them much more on an intimate kind of a model, then we have to be healthy enough within ourselves to be either more immune or more detached from the ways that they're more troubled or critical or difficult or whatever. Yes, cutting them off is one solution. The problem with cutting people off, though, in a family is that typically it's a cataclysmic event in a family. It's not just cutting off. It's not dyadic or triadic. It's
Oh
cutting
my
off,
God.
right?
It has a ripple effect. It impacts third cut. every sibling. It
Exactly.
impacts parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, family, friends. Like
Yep.
everybody has to pick sides.
Yep.
It is so impactful. It has such a huge ripple effect. Yeah, I
Yep.
think that's really important that people be cognizant that when they're making a decision to go no contact, it's not just about you and
No.
this moment.
Right.
It's going to have impacts like throughout the entire family.
That's right. And it may cut off your own children from their cousins and often their grandparents, because typically if an adult child cuts off a parent, they also typically cut off access to the grandchildren, which is tragic for grandchildren and grandparents. So no, it is. It's a cataclysmic event in families. I think it's well
And you
said how you
never
put it.
you never get those younger years back with the kids.
No,
Like you never get them back. Maybe you reconnect when they're older teenagers, but you're never going to get those in between years back.
no, it's
And it's
absolutely true.
so then if I have little children and my parents and I do not speak, then would you recommend that somebody let their children have a relationship with the grandparents? But I can understand that in order for someone to be estranged or make that decision in their mind, they've probably already done the math and determined that it's unhealthy. So then why would they expose their child to the unhealthy person?
Well, see, this is what bothers me about the way this is typically said by the adult child, because I've worked with a lot of families where, by the adult child's own reckoning, the grandparent was a good grandparent, but they say, but my relationship with you is toxic. So if it isn't good for me, then it's not good for my child. And I think it's kind of bullshit, because I think you can, you may have a grandparent who's a fantastic grandparent. Your kids may get enormous benefit from that. Okay, so you don't like your parent, and maybe your parent doesn't like you. I don't know, but as long as they're not like trying to brainwash your child against you, and of course that does sometimes happen, but a lot of grandparents don't do that. They're just grateful to have any relationship with their grandchildren. So I think there's a great conflation that I see a lot of adult children who say, well, if it's not good for me, it's not good for my kids. Well, that's not always true. And also, one thing I hear a lot is, well, you traumatized me, so I don't want to continue. The buck stops here. It's like, well, actually, the buck isn't stopping there, because you're actually traumatizing your parent by cutting off your relationship to them. And you may be traumatizing your children by denying them access to their grandparents if they had a loving, close relationship with them before. So it's all very complicated.
I think that's a very, very heavy and fair point to make, that I've never contemplated that the parent feels traumatized by
Oh,
the child
absolutely.
going, but of course, that makes sense. So when two people are estranged, I would imagine that there's a power dynamic that would emerge when one reaches out to the other to reconcile. Is that a thing?
Yes, I mean, with parents, I think they have to take the lead, because from the adult child, it's working for them, right? If you look at the surveys of adult children, they say they feel less stressful, they feel happier, they feel less distracted, they feel like they're taking charge of their life, they're cutting out toxic people, they're setting boundaries, and there's enormous social support. For the parent, it's all downside. It's all shame, guilt, regret, loss, fear, anger. So there's no upside for the parent. So I always tell parents they have to take the initiative. Now, sometimes parents get pissed off at me about that and say, well, why should I have to take the initiative? It's like, well, do you want a relationship with your child or not? You have to take the initiative, because they're not going to take it. It's working for them. It's not working for you. It's basic game theory. The person who has the least amount of power has to actually make more movements in the other person's direction. So, yeah, so somebody has to be willing to make themselves vulnerable. And what parents will sometimes say to me is, well, I'm not going to humiliate myself. And I say, it's not about humiliation, it's about humility. It's accepting that, there may be things that your child sees in you that you can't see in yourself. We all have our blind spots as parents and as people. For me, I was kind of an impatient person when I was raising my children. All three of my kids say, yeah, you were impatient. I didn't really feel impatient. I mean, I get it, they say it, but it was much bigger in their mind than it was in my mind. And we all have character flaws. So having some humility about that and seeing that, there's separate realities in families. And a parent could reasonably feel like they did a good job. And their child, could have felt at the time and now as an adult that they really missed something really important about who they are and what they needed. And so humility just means you kind of accept that. You don't come from the perspective of, I was a perfect parent and you're being so ungrateful and unfair, because nothing's going to happen with that perspective.
And that makes sense to me in the power, in the inherent, because in the parent-child dynamic, there's an inherent power imbalance. Ideally, the parent leads by example.
Right.
Child didn't ask to be born.
Right.
Parent wanted the child. Parents got some obligation. But let's broaden this to other family members where there's not an inherent power dynamic because one is the parent. Like this happens with siblings all the time.
All the time.
How would you guide a sibling to navigate that power imbalance that would inherently be triggered when one reaches out to the other?
Well, typically it's the person who wants the relationship more that has to make the move, and that's why parents are often having to kind of walk over hot coals because they really want it more. So in a sibling relationship, one sibling may be fine with it, another sibling may be in deep pain about it. So if they're the one who's in deep pain, they have to approach the other sibling from the perspective that they did something with that sibling in the past that caused them to feel like estrangement was the healthiest thing for them. And they have to kind of approach it with similar kinds of language that clearly I've done things in the past that were hurtful or disruptive to you. And I really want to understand. And I'm hoping that we can heal our relationship. I'm willing to take responsibility and hear the things that bothered you and hope you'll give me that opportunity. So again, it's about sort of being willing to be vulnerable and making the first move that makes the biggest difference.
Dialing up the curiosity as you dial down the defensive and
Absolutely.
reactiveness. Yeah.
Yep,
Like you
exactly.
have to literally show up with a willingness to be curious and hear what the other person has to say. That is a tall order.
It's a tall order, particularly if you've got your own story. It's like with parents.
Well, and everyone does.
And everybody
Because
does.
in order to make that decision or to make
Yep.
peace with the decision being thrust upon you, you
Yep.
had to have come up with a story that
Yep.
you can live with. And
Right.
then we're talking about deconstructing that narrative.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, and for two healthy people who are willing to go there, a lot can happen, but it doesn't always happen that way. We both know as people who are in the field that family therapy can only proceed as quickly as the least healthy member, and that's often true in family relationships in general. It can't go any faster than the least healthy person can go. So sometimes accommodations have to be made. Sometimes people have to radically accept people's limitations. But you're right. Everybody kind of has a story. And sometimes we have to suppress our own need to tell our story. Parents in particular, parents will often say to, I know, small.
You just took my breath away. Oh, go on. I can handle it. I'm sweating a little. Go on.
Not in the right way, right? Yeah, for parents in particular, parents will often say to me, well, when do I get to tell my side of the story? And I say, well, maybe never. Because if your child is too fragile, or they just can't they feel like whatever your story is an excuse or a defense, or you can't tolerate their pain, you may never be able to tell your story. And you have to kind of have some serenity around that if you want the relationship.
Yeah. Those two things, they seem contradictory, but it's dialectical thinking. Do you want to tell your story or do you want to be in a happy relationship?
Exactly.
You may not be able to get both.
That's right. No, I think thinking of it dialectically is exactly right.
Which is when you put two concepts together that do not seem like they can go together, but they have to, because we unfortunately live in a very complex world.
That's right. Yeah. And it sort of reminds me of a saying that Marshall Linehan had, who was the founder of dialectical behavior therapy, that I always tell parents, and that is that the pathway through hell is through misery. The more you fight your misery, the more you stay in hell. And so there, the dialectic is you have to accept your pain where you are right now and learn how to tolerate it so that you can feel all of your feelings and move off of the shoals of your pain. So yeah, I think the dialectical model is really interesting.
Are there any scenarios where you would imagine a person might be in where you could see recommending them walking away from a family member?
Well, I've certainly supported some who, I've been in family therapy with a parent and adult child and said to the parent, some parents are just completely non-responsive. They won't do the basic things that the adult child is reasonably asked them to do. And I've said to more than one parent, look, I can't encourage your child to reconcile with you if you can't do this basic thing. If you can't just learn not to criticize them or shame them to their children or gossip about, if you can't do these basic things, it's unethical for me to recommend that your child reconcile with you. You're not really, you have to take responsibility as a parent. You don't just get to say, well, I'm the parent, I raised you, I sacrificed for you, so I get to have whatever relationship I want with you. Bullshit. No, you don't. And particularly these days, maybe in some cultures you still do, but not here. So that's certainly a scenario. I think some parents are just so destructive and so unsympathetic and so unconscious of their own destructiveness that I mean, I don't recommend it in the same way that I don't recommend a parent with children get divorced because they have to live with the consequences, And so I feel like it's up to them to do it. I feel like my role and our role in general as therapists is to be more of a consultant in that, to help them look at kind of the both sides perspective. But there are certainly cases where I'm completely sympathetic to it and make that known. So that's about as close as I get. Yeah.
That feels very fair, that there's
Yeah.
there's a moral obligation on the part of us as therapists to determine and make our own judgments about how safe is the space that I'm encouraging my client to move back into. Mhm.
And what are the consequences if they do estrange them, to also face them with, yeah, but it may be that then your kids aren't going to have a grandparent. What's that going to be like? What are you going to say to your children? Are you going to also be estranged from your siblings? I mean, to help them kind of have the whole three-dimensional view, I think that's part of our role.
Yeah, yeah, that tracks with me.
Yeah.
So if people are estranged, how likely are they to reconcile?
Well, we don't have, well, actually, no, we do have some statistics. The study I was talking about earlier with Lynn Resnick, she found that 80% of mothers eventually get a reconciliation, and 69% of fathers do. So, they're pretty good statistics for mothers, not terrible for dads, but not great for dads. I mean, a fairly high percentage. I think, I don't, it isn't like everybody who does my method reconciles, but I think they're more likely to do it if they do than if they don't do it. So I think there are things that parents can often do or family members can do, but I don't think there's anything either of us could tell anybody, oh, just do these 5 simple steps and you're guaranteed to have a reconciliation. It's just not the way
Nope.
family dynamics work.
There's another variable we can't control for.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's right.
We could give them the most sound advice imaginable, and if it's not
Yeah.
well received, it's not going to go anywhere.
Nowhere. Exactly.
So do the stats on likeliness to reconcile, do they change with the length of time that people have been estranged? Like the longer you've been estranged, are you therefore less likely to reconcile?
I don't think we have good statistics on that. My clinical experience would say yes to that. I think in terms of the small amount of research that's been done, the average is between 2 and 3 years before there's a reconciliation. So if I'm working with a parent, there's been a 10-year estrangement, I'm more skeptical about that resolving than if there's been, say, a 1-year estrangement, because I think sometimes people just get kind of comfortable with things being as they are. But I have worked with parents who've had really long-term estrangements and the adult child eventually did come back, or they were responsive to the outreach either by me or the parent. So we never know, really. But if we're speaking in generalities, that's how I would think of that.
But you are a little bit more skeptical the longer people have lived without each other, because by nature of the length of time, we become a little bit, we've adjusted, we transition.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think
Yeah,
so.
and we don't, and that pain point of the initial transition is often what causes us to reconcile.
Right. That's true. Yeah, well said.
So if somebody wants to reconcile with a family member, how do you suggest they start, generally speaking?
I mean, I find that the letter of amends is the most powerful tool that anybody can do. And a letter starts in the way I was saying earlier. I know you wouldn't do this unless it was the healthiest thing for you to do. I'm reaching out in the hopes of opening up a dialogue with you. If the parent or family member knows what the issues are, they should say it in a very straightforward, unvarnished way without explanation or excuse. I know that I was whatever, I was abusive or I was angry a lot, or the divorce from your mother was really upsetting to you, or, any of the things that actually occurred that the child has said should be in the letter without any kind of excuse or explanation. And then to say that I regret that. And I'm open to doing my own therapy if it's something that you want me to be working on in my therapy. If you're open to doing family therapy, I would welcome that as well. Hope you let me know, love, mom, dad, et cetera, or, sis or brother. If you absolutely don't know, then I encourage people to write this kind of a letter where you would start the same way. You wouldn't do it unless you thought it was the healthiest thing for you to do. But then say, it's clear that I have significant blind spots as a parent or sibling or whatever, that I don't have a better understanding. And maybe I haven't done a good job helping you to feel like it's okay for you to tell me what your complaints are about me. But I would like to know, and I'm wondering if you feel comfortable writing and telling me more about your perspective. I promise to read or listen purely to understand and not defend myself. Or if you want me to do therapy or my family therapy, that as well. So, in that situation, you're saying, complain about me, just tell me what's going on. I think that's really the most important step, because it's a way to say that you're not there to defend yourself. It's safe to get in the water. You really want to accept them for who they are and where they are and take responsibility. And I think those are the most important principles.
I love that. And that makes so much sense. And that is, I wonder how long, like when you're in your private practice working with a patient and they're trying to draft that, how many versions does it take, generally speaking? I mean, you must be redlining it left and right because
I am.
that you make it sound so simple, and
It's
to
not.
not explain, to simply lead with vulnerability and curiosity and a willingness to take responsibility,
Yeah.
that is such a big deal, and it's beautiful and it's ideal. So how many drafts does that usually take when you're the director of it?
Well, I usually have parents send me do a draft themselves, and I say don't spend hours on it because I'm probably going to edit it anyway. Um,
Down
and
to a paragraph.
yeah, 2 paragraphs max. Yeah, like I said, don't do chapter and verse here. Like 2 paragraphs max. And a lot of things that parents will put in letters are also problematical. Maybe I wasn't a perfect parent, or all the other excuses, or I thought we had a really close relationship, or I think you're forgetting all the good times we had, or whatever. It's just totally irrelevant. So, I mean, usually, yeah, I mean, if it was just up to the parent, it's very rare that I don't edit the letters. Well, I'll put it that way. But I'll also warn the parent in advance. I'll say, you need to write what I call the throw the parent under the bus letter, which means you're going to have to go do a much deeper dive into your child's experience. And if I see the correspondence from the adult child, because sometimes the adult child's written a lengthy letter that kind of lays it all out. I mean, the parent may not agree with it, but it may say, you did this, you didn't do that, you did this. And the parent has to find a way to empathize with it and take responsibility and acknowledge it. So that's a lot of what the editing process is you need to include a lot more of this, take out this, and make it a pure act of vulnerability and compassion and nothing else.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And sometimes you have to redirect the parent back to the fact that there's a contract with a witness that explained the whole thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And it still didn't work.
But it's not about me. It's about the rest of you.
That's right. Exactly. That's
Final
great.
question. What
Mhm.
resources would you recommend to support someone who is estranged from a family member?
I mean, my most recent book, Rules of Estrangement, was written with having worked with probably thousands of people between my webinars and private practice and everything else. And I also have a website. I have a free newsletter for estranged parents that comes out 3 or 4 times a week with lots of advice. I have an ongoing webinar series. If people can't afford it, let me know. I'll give it to them for free. I have a free Q&A every other Monday at 11:30 Pacific. I also have a private Facebook group for estranged parents and grandparents on my website. Yeah, that's kind of what I offer from my side. But I think there's other estranged parents Facebook groups out there as well and that kind of thing.
I literally can imagine some of my clients wanting to sign their parents up for your newsletter, like so that they get the estranged parents, so that they can see the errors of their ways. But
Yeah.
so let's not do that. But those sound like amazing resources. I'm sure that
Oh, thank you.
there's a deep wealth of knowledge in all of that. Dr. Coleman, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Where can people find you?
www.drjoshuacoleman.com. It's Dr. Joshua Coleman, spelled like the lantern.com.
Well, I'm really sorry for the reason for your specialty, but the world is probably a better place because of it. And I'm
Oh,
glad
well,
that you and
thank
your
you.
daughter are well mended and having a nice, loving relationship now.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
We Need to Talk with Dr. Darcy Sterling is a Sterling Standard production. Editing and sound engineering by Bart McGall. Our theme music is by Trending Music. Special thanks to Amanda Christiani and Preston Smith. If you know someone who doesn't talk to a family member, let's be real, you cannot forward this to them. So go to my social media and repost this episode so they see it. We'll be back on Tuesday with another episode jam-packed with the dating, relationship, and mental health hacks you won't get anywhere else. See you then.